Okay, hi, my name is LaQuarion Bradley.
And I'm Sara Watkins.
My name is Meghan Fitch.
And we're going to discuss crisis theory and social work practice, principles, settings, strengths, and limitations. So crisis theory, a crisis, according to Linger and Leitz, is a temporary inability to function in a way that one might normally function, and this can be both personal and external. A crisis intervention is short-term resolution of a crisis, and there were principles created to better understand and aid in that resolution process. So crisis explained, a crisis can basically mean that an individual is unable to cope, problem solve, or generally circumvent a situation or circumstance that arises, and this varies depending on the individual. Crisis events generally lead to fight or flight, which is an automatic psychological response that can result in self-defense or an individual fleeing. Many times individuals can experience chronic stress, and this makes them have like a baseline of high levels of anxiety, which can imply that anything can tip them into a crisis. And this is where prevention is important. Prevention looks like coping skills and assessing their use of coping skills, whether that be healthy or unhealthy, and their knowledge of the coping skills that can assist them with finding ways to de-escalate. So following de-escalation, the individual is either back at baseline or is needing a higher level of care to assist with getting them back at baseline. And this will prevent future crises, just making sure that we're helping them with healthy coping skills and managing their symptoms that's associated with chronic stress. So practice principles of crisis theory. Principle 1 is that it's time limited and short term. This implies that the level of the crisis is manageable enough to where the clinician is able to bring the situation from a 10 to about a 4 at least. Principle 2, engagement and assessment occur simultaneously and efficiently. This requires active engagement and assessment quickly so that we can prepare ways to de-escalate. Principle 3, meet concrete and emotional needs through the provision of services. This allows the clinicians to meet the emotional needs. And many times that can mean simply active listening and showing empathy. And other times it could mean taking action and providing resources. It just depends on the crisis. Principle 4, move quickly, seeking to help client return to previous levels of functioning. And this is making sure that we're doing everything that we need to return them to their baseline, whether that be providing positive feedback, words of encouragement, resources, and or a higher level of care.
So here we have a crisis theory practice model that is a combination of a number of models and designed by Roberts in 2005. Roberts describes 7 stages through which people generally experience a crisis. And these stages shown here, starting from the bottom, moving up, are essential, sequential, although sometimes overlapping in the process of crisis intervention. You'll see at the bottom, it starts with making a plan and conducting a thorough biopsychosocial assessment, including an assessment of lethality and imminent danger. The second stage is to establish rapport and attempt to develop a relationship quickly, which requires making psychological contact and establishing a collaborative relationship, which will help with the next stage, which is stage 3 here, which is identifying the major problems, including identifying what was the last straw that led to the person's or the client's feeling of entering a crisis where their resources were beyond their ability to cope, and they're having this subjective psychological experience of a crisis. And stage 4 here is to encourage the client to explore their feelings and emotions, which will employ the micro skills of active listening and reflection and validation on behalf of the clinician. Stage 5 is generating and exploring alternatives, alternative stories and narratives, and as well as alternatives to the coping mechanisms that have been exhausted or not working for the client at this time. Stage 6 is to restore, is an attempt to restore functioning through the implementation of a plan of action. So we're working with the client to establish a plan and create a sense of control over the circumstances. And finally, stage 7 is a follow-up agreement and plan for needed additional resources or booster sessions to make sure that the client is in a place where they feel capable of dealing with the stressors in their present circumstance. Next slide, please.
And this brings us to practice settings. Certain rules to be followed during practice settings for interventions with a client in crisis is, number 1, to establish emotional boundaries between the social worker and the client. Number 2 is to structure the interview with possible client experiencing underreacting or overreacting. So this can look like not saying too much or too little, keeping everything in, to saying everything. Both can occur during a crisis. And number 3 is create strategies for social worker self-care. Next slide. So different settings from micro to meso and macro could be anywhere from an individual behavioral health counseling center, rape crisis center, domestic violence shelter, school shooting crisis response team, national crisis response, natural disasters, county jail, residential homes, neighborhoods, and schools. So there's many settings in which crisis intervention occurs. There are times when all of our lives we do experience a crisis situation, whether it be expected or unexpected. And so with that, it's essential that once a client receives crisis intervention to stabilize our clients. And within settings like a school environment, they are often expected to be the well-oiled machine and always be ready for a time of crisis. And that's when it becomes crucial to have a crisis response team within that setting. And when we're talking about different settings within different cultural differences, like with a cultural diverse group, crisis treatment might look a lot different. It's important for the clinician to understand culture and respect the individual and their beliefs and where they're coming from when trying to apply crisis response. Next slide.
So I'll be discussing the strengths and limitations. Next slide, please. So among the strengths of the crisis theory are its flexibility. The model and protocols for crisis assessment and intervention are adaptable to various circumstances and practice settings, as we've discussed previously. The theory can be applied at the micro, meso, and macro intervention level, although it is important that we do not use a one-size-fits-all approach, as Sara explained, that social workers should be aware of cultural competence in selecting interventions and in acting in a way that is culturally competent and responsive to the varying beliefs and backgrounds of the clients. The crisis theory models, many have well-established research supports, and the models are well developed that create for example, stages, as in the image depicted on the slide here, that helped us to conceptualize and sequence our approach to crisis intervention. The models are generally user-friendly. For example, the ACT model by Roberts in 2002, which is an acronym for Assessment, Crisis Intervention, and Trauma Treatment. It can provide the models can provide frameworks with well-defined rules for teams and trainings that are comprehensive for prevention and planning in case of a crisis at an organizational level. And finally, the crisis theory can be compatible with the social work values of self-determination and respect for the worth and dignity of all people. Next slide, please. Among the limitations of crisis theory are that it's time limited. So if the client is experiencing problems after the 4 to 6 week intervention period, there will be a need for referral to other services, and any of the symptoms or problems that persist beyond that time or beyond the scope of the intervention or the theory. So this could be problematic in the case of rape, where creating stability through crisis intervention may be helpful. The long-term effects of the traumatic experience of rape may not be addressed through the crisis intervention model, and attempting to establish rapport quickly may be problematic for the client who has had a traumatic experience of violation, and maybe less likely to trust, and in that fight, flight, or freeze stage may be defensive or reluctant to create a collaborative relationship with the social worker. So another limitation is that there are challenges to measuring the effectiveness of the theory itself. Often the measurements are confounded with the measure the effectiveness of the intervention or the model that's being used. So it's difficult to say, is it the solution-focused therapy or trauma-focused CBT that really accounts for the change or movement from a crisis stage into a more homeostatic state of lowered stress. And finally, it's not always applicable. So if the client does not perceive that they are in a stressful situation that's beyond their ability to cope, then it isn't a crisis. So a crisis is not an event. It is a perception of an event or situation that the client perceives as being overwhelmingly difficult, so much so that it exceeds, their personal resources and the use of customary coping mechanisms. So it's important that we remember that the client may not perceive a situation as a crisis, although it may appear to be a crisis to the clinician or to the social worker. We need to be responsive to the client's perceptions and recognize that if the client is not in a state of crisis, then a crisis theory intervention model would not be applicable. Thank you. And next slide, please. And do my colleagues have any final thoughts?
No, I think you did great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for listening to this presentation, and we hope that it will help you to understand and apply crisis theory in a culturally competent and applicable way. And finally, we have our references listed here. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you.